I want to start with there are people here who are likely engage with poetry, but don't engage with Ottawa. And there are people from Synapcity who likely engage with Ottawa and don't so much engage with poetry. So we've sort of got this neat intersection. So I want to start out with asking you, from where you sit, from your perspective in Ottawa, to bring to life a little bit, what is sort of the poetry scene in Ottawa? And part of me thinks, let's think about this pre-COVID or pre-COVID and COVID. But I'm wondering, to give people a flavor of what is it, where does it happen, who's involved with it, how is it shifting, who's the audience, who's passionate about it, etc. So let's just bring to life a little bit an understanding of poetry in Ottawa. And Ben, what if you kick us off?
Me. Okay. Well, I'll kick us off, but I'm sure that I'll only be able to cover like a very small amount of the ground. So in terms of your question, I guess I'll speak about my own personal experience as a person who had that question. And I grew up in Ottawa, and in fact, I went to Canterbury High School in the literary arts program. So that's a good place to start. Where that is, so that's an art school, and it's the only art school in Canada to have a literary arts program. And I'm very much a product of that program, and continue a relationship with it, visiting randomly. Well, not randomly, they ask me to come and I come. But so coming out of Canterbury, I feel like for a long time in my life, I used to think that everybody is just so everybody writes poetry in elementary school. Most people write poetry in high school, then people kind of stop usually, and then many people come back to it. And I didn't stop, and I now understand that that's very unusual, and that most people stop at least a little bit, but I didn't stop. So I can account for the poetry scene in Ottawa from adolescence. So, and what I'll say is that the universities in Ottawa, both Ottawa and Carleton, have robust literary lives. I can speak towards Carleton's more because that's where I went, but University of Ottawa had like the Ottawa Arts Review, hosted readings at like Cafe Nostalgica, readings around campus, readings in that pub in University of Ottawa that I can't remember the name of. And there was always poetry events going on. And at Carleton, same thing, there would be poetry events at Mike's Place, poetry events in kind of the atmosphere around Carleton. And specifically a magazine that Carleton published and that I was on the editorial board for was Inwards Magazine, where I made a lot of friends that I still have today, including Cameron Anstey, who let me borrow my own book for this reading, because all my things are in boxes. And so what I'm trying to illustrate there is that all ages, pre-COVID, you can find an environment in which to introduce yourself as a poet without being embarrassed. And then one other thing I'll say before handing it off to both Jamal and Deanna is that, and I'll let them continue kind of the saga of all the things in Ottawa, I guess. But one other thing that I always thought was usual, but that it turns out is unusual, is that in Ottawa, pre-COVID, there were a lot of open mics. There were several open mics that you could read at as a poet. I moved to Toronto later in life, and I lived there for 3 years, and found that there were a lot of professional writers, professional poets who didn't know how to read in front of people, and who had several books to their name, and didn't really know how to read very well in front of people. So that's a huge offering that Ottawa has, is that this open mic culture, which I think extends to the music scene here as well. It's very it's not so much that you go to shows, it's more that you go to the show of someone is doing a show, and then you go to that, It's like there are opportunities to enter the world and to cut your teeth. And that was lost on me when I was younger, and now I'm really glad that that was the case, because I feel like open mics are a huge part of what I love about poetry, and I think there are a lot of cities that are kind of lacking in that community. So I'll hand things off to Jamal, perhaps, if that's cool.
That's cool.
Cool. Well, that was a robust response. A great start. Thank you, Ben. First of all, thank you for being here, and I apologize for my tardiness. Internet issues are always a thing. So, but I'm glad that I'm here amongst distinguished individuals, and of course, our distinguished audience who took time out today to connect with us and chat poetry. Ken, wonderful, wonderful idea. Thank you very much to you and to Synapcity. So, what can I say that Ben didn't say, or that Deanna won't say? How could I be unique in my own poetic voice here? I think I would say that Ottawa's I was trying to break down the question, what is Ottawa's poetry scene? And if I could relate, if I could use some symbolism or contrast, I would say that Ottawa's poetry scene is like a cult that you can actually come in and out of when you like. So it's not like a cult where you're in, and if you try to leave, there are dire consequences. It's this beautiful cult, community that I think they have a deep and rich appreciation for the literary art form, and they get a chance, an opportunity to step in and step out because it's ongoing. I once had a peer of mine tell me, his name is Rob Reed, and Rob was an event coordinator in Ottawa, a DJ, public figure in a sense in the entertainment and arts and culture world. Rob Reed, in 2012, when I approached him with I'm going to try to make this short. When I approached him with a proposal to include spoken word poetry in the House of Paint Urban Arts Festival, which is an annual festival, hip hop festival that's been going on for like, I think I should know, but it's about 20 years or more. No, my apologies. It's about 13, 14 years now. When I found out in 2012 that spoken word wasn't a part of their programming, of course, I thought it was a big, missed opportunity to bring poetry, especially since spoken word is the birthed hip hop and birthed the hip hop culture. So when I brought him the proposal and he accepted, we had a meeting, and he said, Jamal, let me tell you something from what I know about the poetry and spoken word community in Ottawa. He said, you guys have been the most consistent and the most frequent community of creatives to bring people together for events, to propel the art form itself, and the artistic community. He said, as long as, and this is in my 2012 was my early public stage of, announcing that I'm a poet. And he said, but that community, you guys, he said, the poetry community has been the most consistent. You guys keep Ottawa afloat. I had no idea what he was talking about because I didn't know the history that he understood, but I started to see it from my own involvement from about 2011 up until now. Very rich, and that feeling of like missing out, but coming back in, years later, because Ben is so right. There is a time when people leave poetry and then they reconnect with it right later in their lives. Sometimes it's that university stage for different reasons, political atmosphere and so on, and then other times it's more like, let me get through the crisis of now. If I went to college, university, just settling my feet after post-secondary, and then in their maybe late 20s or 30s, there is that moment where there's a gap. But poetry, the community here is so like we're like bloodhounds. We just love the art form that people can come back to it and you're part of the pack again. It's like you never missed out. And I really feel like that is reflects our connectedness, even though in every genre, in the different genres, there's a little bit of silos that happen. Page poets sometimes don't know what's going on in the performance poetry world and vice versa. I still think that there's a deep mutual respect. And I do believe what Rob said. We have been one of the most consistent communities, despite the laureate position being, not available for 27 years prior to 2017. Despite that, I still think that Ottawa's poetry community is the most beautiful cult I could ever be a part of.
Thank you, Jamal. That's lovely. So, Deanna, you're inheriting two really robust answers. Is there something left for you to add to the portrait?
Yeah, I'll just try to, I'm just thinking of things that Ben and Jamal haven't mentioned. So for those who don't know, and the poets here will know, but the other attendees, Ottawa for the past 10 years has hosted this incredible international poetry festival called Verse Fest. Pre-COVID, I'll preface everything I say with pre-COVID. This festival happened in March, generally near the end of March, bringing poets from across the country and internationally for readings, live readings and performance here in Ottawa. The festival, after I think the first few years, it was really established as a bilingual festival. It also integrated the more traditional poetry with spoken word and so on. So it, multiple events. So when they did have the festival in the fall online, when everyone was scrambling to figure out what to do with their programming and so on. But post-COVID, I think we can look forward to that festival coming back. And it's certainly something to keep in mind. I'll just mention also that, of course, as the nation's capital and a bilingual city, there's a whole French language poetry scene that I'm not well acquainted with. Also, there's the spoken word scene that I know a little bit about, but not a lot. There's so much going on, actually. I was a director of the Tree Reading Series for about 3.5 years, not long ago, actually, just a couple years prior to Ben. And at that time when I started, there were so many poetry reading series happening in Ottawa that we worried about oversaturation. If you were into poetry, it was like you could go out 4 times a week, but no one could. So that was a problem, that there were too many reading series. I think it may have settled down, but there's also people publishing chapbooks and magazines and so on. So if you're interested, there's a ton out there.
I'd like to also just quickly add that it's one of the most diverse communities when it comes to the artistic practices. I feel like if we were to gather the different, people, individuals who identify with certain artistic communities, that you would see the most diversity within the poetry communities here in Ottawa. And I'm not exaggerating that at all. It's just so rich and diverse with different expressions, different styles. You don't have to look and conform a certain way. And I've been around many artistic gatherings, and sometimes you could see the patterns of the individuals. But then when you're in poetry spaces, you got the super nerds to the people. I've seen homeless people show up to poetry readings, and it's like, I got to get this poem out. Literally, a wanderer showed up. So it's just a magnificent, and it's rich in that way as well.
That is such a cool endorsement, Jamal. Thanks for adding that in. So I want to ask about, because we've got 2 laureates, this whole thing about the poet laureate of a city. And I'm aware there's no playwright laureate. There's not a musician laureate. There's not a dancer laureate. There's not a sculptor laureate. There's just poet laureates. And I'm curious, I don't mean historically, I'm not interested in, we could all Google, why do cities have poet laureates? I'm wondering more about, what is it about poetry in cities that has the one art that cities sort of proclaim as is poetry? What's your take on cities in poetry and why there seems to be something about them? What is that marriage or relationship? Why is it present at all? Versus another art, which you could have a laureate of. Who wants to kick off playing around with that notion?
Go ahead, Jamal.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have not researched this, so you can't take anything I say as factual, but I'm just speculating. I think it's something about the really ancient character of poetry. The fact that in ancient societies, poets were sort of at the center of a society in terms of poetry and song and storytelling and history keeping and all of these things being integrated. So a poet was also the person who could, hold an audience and tell a story about the history of a place or of a battle or of an important an important event in the culture of a society. And so I suspect that role of the poet in society has just carried through to modern times in this role of the poet laureate. I don't know, maybe that's crazy.
Jamal, you wanted to add?
I absolutely agree with Deanna, and I don't know if it's crazy. I don't think it's crazy. Yeah, it's carried on, and eloquent orators were the ones who were like archivists as well, right? And they were like the viziers, the unofficial viziers of storytelling and carrying on traditions within society through oration. But I feel like there's a reason why, the reason why there are poet laureates is because poetry is an art form that is to conform to poetry, you write, or you communicate through writing or speaking. But when you look at the other art forms, there are so many other essential things that have to be in place to practice these art forms, from visual art to dance to theater. Poetry is, what's up? Our theater practitioners here. Poetry is a lot more free. There's a lot more freedom. And because there's a lot more freedom and there's less restriction, they say poetic license. I've never heard anybody say dance license, when they say you have poetic license, right? I mean, it could exist, but, and maybe that's called creative license, but there is a specific term says poetic license. I just feel with the practice of poetry, life can be expressed poetically. And yes, life can be expressed musically and visually, but there's so many small mechanisms needed to express that with the other art forms. But when we say life expresses itself poetically, or everything is poetry, it's kind of like think about like an alien spaceship. There's that one motherboard head that's, functioning all the other things. I just feel like poetry has that breadth, right? Because it's communication in one of the most recognizable forms, right? It's it's through either speaking or writing, right? Oftentimes who judges what is poetry is much looser than what you could say is that music, is that dance, is that painting, and so on, right? And so I just feel like that's the reason why there's a poet laureate, why poet laureate positions have this kind of like status. It's because it speaks in a broader and more extensive way than other art forms can. And not to say that there's a hierarchy there. It just means that the tentacles reach in more kind of like extended and varied ways.
I'll chime in a bit, just a little to add, which is like, and I love what Jamal said about how it's like, yeah, you don't need anything with poetry. So words out of my mouth. But Jamal and Deanna both kind of talked about, especially Jamal talked about like poetry as opposed to other arts, right? But then the question of why we need a poet laureate or an anything laureate at all to express arts, Ken, at the beginning of this, you said that a lot of people here probably don't engage with poetry a lot, but do engage with the city. And I'll bet that for all of those individuals, the last time you engaged with a poem was like at a wedding or funeral or an important life event. If you're not a person who sits down and reads poems, then you know what poetry is, you're familiar with poems, and these might be the avenues in which you're familiar with them. Or back in high school is when you read all your poetry. But in any case, my point is we do turn to poetry. Everyone does at important moments, and we look to it to help us commemorate the big things. And it's really, really good for that, because spoken word aside, and spoken word, I mean, I hate saying spoken word aside, because spoken word is a world of its own in terms of performance. And there are spoken word performances that no other performance medium can rival. But many poems can be read or they can be heard. And there's even an element of accessibility there, where poetry the deaf can enjoy poetry, the blind can enjoy poetry. So we do turn to it at times when we really need to express something that we need absolutely everyone to access. And I think that that's why cities perpetuate this, I like to think, because there is some real value in doing that. And like Jamal said, also like, if there's nothing like a dance either, and there's nothing like music either, and it's just like another equally amazing component to the many ways that we express ourselves.
Great, thank you. I do notice some questions are coming in. We'll see if we have time at the end for some questions, so keep them coming. I noticed one person suggested that Montreal was the creative city of literature in Canada. It is not Montreal, but I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. Okay. One of the things I did was I asked each of the poets to bring 1 to 2 poems about place and city. And so I want to just turn to having a reading a bit for the poets. and we'll have a chance to talk about them. So let's go around in the same circle. So Deanna, we'll start with you, and then Jamal, and then with Ben. So
Okay.
Deanna, go ahead.
Oh, I'll dive right in then. So Ken said he'd like us to each come up with a poem, maybe by someone else, about cities, dealing with cities, and one possibly by ourselves. I'll start with a poem by an American poet who died a few years ago, one of my favorites. His name is Jack Gilbert. And this poem is called Searching for Pittsburgh. It's a place I've never been, by the way. The fox pushes softly, blindly through me at night, between the liver and the stomach, comes to the heart and hesitates, considers, and then goes around it, trying to escape the mildness of our violent world. Goes deeper, searching for what remains of Pittsburgh in me. The rusting mills sprawled gigantically along 3 rivers, the authority of them. The gritty alleys where we played every evening were stained pink by the inferno always surging in the sky, as though Christ and the Father were still fashioning the earth. Locomotives driving through the cold rain, lordly and bestial in their strength. Massive water flowing morning and night throughout a city girded by 90 bridges. Sumptuous shouldered, sleek thighed, obstinate and majestic, unquenchable. All grip and flood, mighty sucking and deep-rooted grace. A city of brick and tired wood. Ox and sovereign spirit. Primitive Pittsburgh. Winter month after month telling of death. The beauty forcing us as much as harshness. Our spirits forged in that wilderness. Our minds forged by the heart. Making together a consequence of America. The fox watched me build my Pittsburgh again and again. In Paris afternoons, on Butte Chaumont, on Greek islands with their fields of stone, in beds with women, sometimes amid their gentleness. Now the fox will live in our ruined house. My tomatoes grow ripe among weeds and the sound of water. In this happy place, my serious heart has made. So, just let that sit for a second. What I love about that poem, it's about a city that is very meaningful to the poet. And it's so meaningful, in fact, that it's in his body. It's something the poet identifies with as something integral to himself. And I think any place, that we sort of live in for a long period of time, especially places where we're born and grow up often, can have that visceral connection to them. I also love in this poem how he refers to Pittsburgh, this big American city that I can only imagine. I know it's full of industry, but I think he also calls it a wilderness, and talks about the water and the bridges that obviously go over rivers. So it's a dense, complex poem, and it just keeps feeding me and giving me a lot to think about in terms of how the poet's relationship with this city.
Deanna, do you want to read your next poem?
Sure. So when Ken told me about this event, it was a while before I remembered that in one of my books, I actually have a whole section called The City. I had forgotten that. So this poem is, and I'm approaching the idea of the city sort of sideways, very subtly here. I don't honestly write a lot. I don't write poems necessarily about cities, But when I look, I see the place where I'm in, often a city emerging out of the poem. So this is from my book, House Dreams, and it's called The Linden Tree, which is in fact a very large linden tree, which grows right out the window of my bedroom. Lift the blind on a sunless morning near the end of October. The linden tree has been changed overnight. Yesterday green, and now this sea of shifting lemon slices pouring light in your eyes. As you have been changed many times in this life by a wind that made walking your straight line to the bus stop hard. Darkness that fell early and was there by your bed when you woke up. At those times, a chemistry erupted that made you older, more beautiful too, and you held on with extraordinary will to be all right in the arms of each new disaster. You gathered yourself in as a mother gathers children around her in the cold or in foreign places, and emerged more luminous after. Each time, what looked like death never really was. So for me, I live in a city at this time in my life. However, I focus a lot on the natural elements, whether it be rivers or trees or things in the garden and so on. So, even though you live in a city, your focus can still be on the wildlife, the natural part of the environment you're in. I know I appreciate poets who do focus on other aspects of the city, the industry and the density of the population and so on. But when I'm in the city, I tend to look for those elements that are not essential to the city, the wildness underneath the city, I guess. And so that poem about the tree, and a lot of my poetry has a deeply personal, spiritual sort of bent, and I'll find it anywhere, even in the city.
Thanks, Deanna.
You're welcome.
Jamal.
Wow. Deanna, thank you for that recitation. It's unfortunate I haven't had the opportunity to experience your work, on a consistent basis. So thank you for that. Wonderful. Loved it. So I have two poems. The first poem is a poem about a city, a specific place, and it happens to be a poem from Langston Hughes titled Harlem. And ironically, it's the same poem that I first was introduced to when I discovered poetry when I was a child. It's the first poem I ever read on my own. I wasn't offered to read it from a elementary school teacher. I just went to the library and I wanted to find poets that looked like me, and stumbled upon a book of poems from Langston. And it was the first poem I read. I opened it up, and the poem is titled Harlem. And while Langston spent his later years in life in New York City and Harlem, he didn't grow up in Harlem. He had a deep connection to New York City, and he's often referred to as the leader of the Harlem Renaissance through his work. This piece, of course, titled Harlem, is him reflecting on the state of Harlem and what it felt like to him at the time when he was living there. The poem goes, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" So that poem is what I love about that poem is that he speaks about a city without speaking about a city. You may not recognize even that he's speaking about a city, or sorry, an area, a neighborhood, right, a district. You may not recognize he's speaking about a place if you don't know the title or the context. So of course that's a poetic, technique and whatnot, but he conjures up so much emotion in this piece. And I really believe that Langston's sentiments and how he works emotion into his writing is what was captivating. So in this piece, he's telling you that Harlem is a place that if you lived in it, you might have amazing dreams. And that is connected to Harlem being a place of such rich culture and potential. However, there's difficulty in that potential, because only recently I really picked apart this poem, one of my favorite pieces, but I really picked it. His contrast, when he first gives you something that has potential and power, it's beautiful, and then he shows you what it turns into afterwards, right? So dream, deferred, right? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, right? So raisins, you got the grape, which is historically, for the wealthy, and then it dries up. And then you have fester like a sore and then run. When you think of running, athleticism, but then something hinders you from running, right? And then I feel like the contrast between the lines, like a syrupy sweet. What's before the syrupy sweet? It's the candy that we all enjoy. He's showing how being a resident of Harlem can be just like that. Lots of potential, but the challenges and difficulties in Harlem make it so that many people don't reach their fuller potential. So I love that piece because it spoke to me. I was new in Canada. I was 9 years old, and I was feeling alone, and I felt like Ottawa didn't see me. I felt invisible, and I felt, not like my dreams couldn't be achieved, but I definitely felt like that it'd be a difficult time continuing to live here. And it's because I was bullied and so on and so forth. But thank goodness I got over that. Poetry saved my life. So that's that poem. I love it. I love it.
Jamal, do you want to read your other poem?
I don't want to take up too much time. It's a longer piece, spoken word. I could share it.
I'm actually, how are we doing for time?
Yeah, just because spoken word poets, 3 minutes.
Jamal, it's such a city poem. It is such a city poem medicine. So I think it's worth taking the time for you to read it.
All right, I'll read it, and I won't give any, I won't blurb about it. So let's go. This one longer, but I enjoyed writing this piece. She said, "Our diversity is our medicine." She said, "Our diversity is our medicine, gathering all the beauty in one word, gathering all the beauty in the world in one unifying sentence." And how could I challenge her when I have sampled a taste of utopian togetherness, trading in a lens of ignorance for a culture of multiple expressions and languages? When I was younger, I never spoke about how intense I studied the human condition. My earliest memories begin with my father's Guyanese shoulders, embracing my mother in moonlight shuffle, as if they had memorized a legendary routine from a champion figure skating couple. When he would halt his waltz, kneel to the ground, and tuck us in under blankets that warmed our bodies from the cold floor, hoping to make sense of complex emotions shown by world travelers and globetrotters that would eventually settle on Canadian soil. Watching moments of contemplation flash like brainstorms, only to transform into revolutionary actions, actions that would ultimately alter my understanding of what it feels to know when one is home. Those were the days when we first arrived to Ottawa, shelters becoming natural habitats until this glowing city of growing opportunity helped us back on our feet. In these days of decades past, I would meet faces attached to stories that carried history from all across Earth's marvelous landscapes. It was on Elmira Drive and Irish Street, where I crossed cultures from everywhere, found lodging in the communities that shared the same longing as me, spoken in a language of triumph and resiliency, witnessed in the silent pride of a Cambodian man's smile, who hides the pain of all that he and his wife left behind to find new hope in a country that promises a better life. He shows no teeth, but his grin is chin high and his eyes beam with glory, as if the future told him that eventually it would all be worth the journey. A language that reflects the ancient family lineage recited from a Somali mother's call for her children, playing chase in the twilight of August Eve, as if tribe and sibling had the same meaning. She sings out names from the corner of her mouth like I've never heard before. Samatar, Abdi Fattah, Nasra, Muhammad. And all at once I could taste the camel milk flow from the corner of my mouth like the Horn of Africa, sweeping peninsula to exotic islands in the Caribbean where Haitian diasporic doorsteps play zouk and compa, and elders fry fish, and elders' hands fry fish and chicken drumsticks, sizzling stoves, blowing smoke through windows that would invite the auditory senses into a euphoria of nostalgia and hospitality when the Creole escapes their mouths. You can hear the resistance still chanting freedom songs from the motherland, mixed with the chance to start a new renaissance on the frontiers of a liberated land. It didn't take much for us to celebrate the everyday. And when special occasions came, ceremonies to honor joyous commemorations, we danced the Lebanese dabka as if it was taught to us through breath and lung rituals that matched the rhythm of the sacred lute and tabla, or at least we watched in awe as men with the frames of size and the size of goalposts dip low, then leap beyond whatever struggles their fellow countrymen face back home. All that I was searching for, from subtle sunrise, midday sunshine, and moving well beyond shimmering sunsets, could be captured in these intense interactions of harmonious rapture. A place where my heart could be embedded in the art of solidarity, and my understanding of our collective Canadian identity unraveled in that single moment of affinity when she said to me, "Our diversity is our medicine." I will never know what memories she carried beneath her skin that would lead her to share such welcoming empathy. An indigenous woman who spoke truth beyond her own history of genocide that has robbed her of her rightful claim to reconcile home. Maybe it was her native traditions that reminded her that we are one once we defeat the walls of ignorance and isolation. But in one unifying sentence, with wisdom beyond my experience, she showed me that if we are ever to know how deep our beauty and empathy resides, we shall see it in the hope, the healing, the stories that lie in a newcomer's eyes. That's medicine, and it's about me growing up here in Ottawa and how it has shaped me and how much I love the city, really.
Jamal, I have one question that comes out of this. You have this line in the poem where it says, "My understanding of what it feels to know when one is home." Is there a moment where you knew that Ottawa was home? That the city felt like home to you?
That's a deep question. When did I feel like Ottawa was home to me? I know, when I got out of ESL. I wrote that first poem and they had me in ESL. They thought I didn't speak English, but I did. I just had a patois. And when I wrote that first poem and 2 weeks later I was taken out of ESL, I realized this is a place I can thrive if I learn how to speak the language of the people. And that's what also just kept me going in poetry as well too.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you. Great question.
Ben.
Yes, hello. These have been gorgeous readings so far. So we've heard from like a total of 4 very different voices. And what I like about that is that, as you said, Ken, there's a lot of people here who maybe don't engage with poetry very often. So what a breadth we've seen so far, right? And the things that Deanna accomplished in her poetry painted a very clear picture of a city, not in a visual way, but in a kind of mnemonic way. And then Jamal with a very different approach, like this really narrative kind of understanding of city and it's a city and its vibrancy. So gorgeous readings. I love being here and getting to listen to this. I think that, so Langston Hughes, who's the poet that Jamal shared, paints a stunning picture of Harlem. And the poet who I kind of picked out talks about a very different area of New York. And the poet I picked is Frank O'Hara, who, and it's not a poem of his about New York that I've chosen to share. And in fact, I couldn't really find, partly because all my books are in boxes right now because I'm moving, but partly because well, I couldn't find poetry of his that really mentions New York. I'm sure it's out there. There are poems of his that mention New York, but I realized that I didn't need to find one because it's a lot like what I've heard said more than once about Edith Piaf, how she just sounds like Paris. Like you listen to Edith Piaf and you're transported to Paris. And I have the same relationship, and I think many have the same relationship with this guy, Frank O'Hara. So Frank O'Hara was a poet operating in the art circles. He worked at galleries. He was also a poet and associated with a lot of the artists in New York in 50s, 60s. He wrote about Fire Island. He wrote about the art scene there. He wrote about his friends. He wrote about like walking around the street. I picked his poem, a favorite poem of mine of his called Mayakovsky. Doesn't mention New York, but reading it and listening to it, I feel like I'm there. So hopefully that comes off a little bit, and it's a shorter poem, and then I'll read one of my own. So Mayakovsky by Frank O'Hara. My heart is a flutter. I am standing in the bathtub crying. Mother, mother, who am I? If he will just come back once and kiss me on the face, his coarse hair brush my temple, it's throbbing. Then I can put on my clothes, I guess, and walk the streets. That's funny. There's blood on my chest. Oh yes, I've been carrying bricks. What a funny place to rupture. And now it is raining. As I step out onto the window ledge, the tracks below me are smoky and glistening with a passion for running. I leap into the leaves, green like the sea. Now I am quietly waiting for the catastrophe of my personality to seem beautiful again, and interesting, and modern. The country is gray and brown and white in trees, snows and skies of laughter, always diminishing, less funny, not just darker, not just gray. It may be the coldest day of the year. What does he think of that? I mean, what do I? And if I do, perhaps I am myself again. So that's from Frank O'Hara. And I'll end the poetry portion, well, the poetry reading portion of this evening by reading one of my own. So Ken asked us to read like poems of our own that are about the city. And what Deanna identified as her thought process really resonates with me, where I was like, I don't know if I write about the city so much. I am in the city and I write about the things around me. So maybe that counts, but I realized that I have a very explicitly city poem in my book, Mad Long Emotion. And I am fond of this poem because it's the very last poem that I wrote for the book. So you have a really special relationship with like the last poem that gets in there. It's called Cub. So I live close to the Byward Market. I used to, when we were all walking to work, I used to walk to work and I would walk through the market on my way to work. One day, on September 6, 2018, there was a bear in the market. You might remember this. It was a couple years ago, but like, we all remember, right? It was a cub. And it had climbed up a tree behind the Coven, which is like the Satanist bar. There was like a crowd gathered because it happened right at like 8:39, like when people were kind of on their way to work, including me. And I was late that day because I stopped and looked at the bear and saw the man carried away. I don't need to tell you anymore because it's all in the poem. But it was the kind of thing where it was such a poem moment. I felt like there was a crowd around me and I thought, oh, we could all go write a poem now. Like this is what you're looking for. This is the gift from above for a poet, that there's a bear in the market, you see it with your own eyes. Cub. Yes, my friend, a tree is a great place for a beast, but here we have a tree with a city at its feet. In the woods, I got good at laying roaring fires and lying down, despite the damp, to sleep. To throw your brethren off the scent, I hung the food I didn't eat in the crown of a sturdy maple. A sun-tough oak trunk told me I belonged. Its heartwood, a coaster, slipped under my coffee. Then it mildewed, bark to pith. I did not belong. Last night, of all elements, neon gave you a headache, gave you a shadow, gave you an in. Yes, my friend, where there is light, there is verdure, but not tonight, and not this light. Enter a tree, there is fencing around, and a dart, there is a kick to, enters you. The officers unrolled a net to break your fall and take you off, 6 pallbearers in their tooth-proof best, blocking all sightlines. The photos were nonetheless taken and fawned over. So good a boy were you, asleep in your drum and unwelcome. So I'm done.
Thank you, Ben. You know, I was looking at all these poems and thinking about them and hearing them. And one of the lines in your poem, Ben, where it says, I did not belong. You know, it's almost this, well, I sort of belonged. And this cub didn't belong in the Byward Market, and I didn't belong out there. And there's all these echoes in everything that we've heard from the three of you about belonging. Is it home? How place makes us, how the place that we grew up in lives in us. And Deanna, you've got that wonderful stanza in your poem where you talk about place makes me, you know, I've been walking in the wind to the bus over and over, the same ritual, walking the city ritual to the bus and the wind, and it's changing me. And so I want to just have you reflect on, and maybe Ben, I sort of go to you because you're the one person who's sort of born and bred in Ottawa. From this audience, you're the born and bred in Ottawa poet. So I'm wondering, so the question I want to ask you is, how would you describe your personal sense of belonging in Ottawa? And are you aware that there are ways that your lifetime in Ottawa has made you? It's in the same way that Jack Gilbert talked about, I'm looking for the Pittsburgh in me. Where is it still? And I'm wondering if you can reflect on what is your sense of belonging in this particular city, in this place, and how it has made you.
Me?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I can pick up where I left off answering your first question, maybe, which is to say that, again, I had the privilege of always kind of being immersed in like the scene here and of being very kind of, in retrospect, like in hyper naive, like extremely naive about things, but I would just kind of show up at readings and see what was going on, poetry readings, I mean. And I answer your question about belonging in the city. I can't not answer it by talking about belonging as a poet in the city. It's like, to me, it's kind of very similar. There's no way to answer the one without answering the other. So after, you know, my time at Inwards, where I left off in my time at Inwards, other scenes I acquainted myself with in Ottawa include Tree Reading Series, which Deanna mentioned, and Verse Fest. And Deanna mentioned that, you know, the two poetry worlds in Ottawa, the page poets and the spoken word poets, don't interact all that much necessarily, but Verse Fest certainly enables that by forcing us to interact. And it also enables the French language and English language poets to interact by forcing us to interact. So there was around the time when the first Verse Fest happened, which I read on the first night of the first Verse Fest with Michael Dennis, who was an Ottawa poet who passed away not long ago, and who we miss, and who we were honored to have featured at Tree earlier this year on my last night as artistic director. So the world was very clear to me, just kind of how big it was. And I feel like it's gotten bigger since, even though I can't speak towards its status after COVID. And I always felt quite welcome in the poetry community in Ottawa. I certainly have a strong desire to like pay that forward And I think that events like this even help, like talking about poetry in the city. Like this is a very helpful thing for me, and hopefully for a few of the people paying attention. But yeah, I guess to belong in the city, I had to feel as though I belonged as an artist. And the poetry community here in Ottawa that we've already kind of established and are talking was there to help me do that. I'd be interested to hear from the other two on the same question.
Deanna, what do you have any reflections on your sense of belonging in Ottawa and how place in Ottawa intersects in you?
Mm-hmm. Well, you've put me on the spot a little bit, Ken. In the sense, I'm not from Ottawa. I grew up in southwestern Ontario, and I've lived in other places in Canada, in Montreal and in Nova Scotia primarily. And I came to Ottawa, as so many people do, for work. But in my case, it wasn't even for my work personally, even though I do work in Ottawa now as an editor in the government currently. But it was for my husband's work that we came. And I didn't want to move to Ottawa. I didn't want to move to any city. We had been living in the country. But cities draw people because of work and industry. And admittedly, it has been a wonderful place for our, kids to grow up. And I still have a son in high school. So I think about how lucky he is to have grown up here and, to live here in the city. So, my relationship with Ottawa is complicated. I mean, I enjoy it. I look to it for, I love the rivers. I love the canal. I sometimes get tired of being in the city, though. I feel like it's not my natural place. And there may be a time before long where I'm not always here, as being the poet laureate of Ottawa right now, I hesitate to say, I'm not necessarily a city person. I appreciate cities. I love big cities. But, I'm here in Ottawa, and I've been here a long time. First moved here in 2002. So, it's been quite some time. But I appreciate parts of it, so many parts of it. And, I think there's something for everyone here. It's one of those cities, it's not too small and it's not really big, So I have a good relationship with Ottawa, I think, but does it feel integral to me the way Pittsburgh does to Jack Gilbert? I'm afraid not. And I have theories about why, and I just think, one of my theories is that the place where we really grew, I think from what I've heard from other people, that has a lot to do with, our sense of ourselves. So for me, I feel like a visitor to Ottawa in a way. Whereas, for example, my son, this is absolutely his home. He was born here and he's lived most of his life here. So, I like Ottawa lots because of that too.
And I appreciate the honest reflection. It occurs to me, if you're not a city person, that's why the poem was titled Linden Tree rather than the bus stop.
Exactly.
It's like, there's the tree
Yeah.
is there. I live in the city, but I'm going to focus on that tree.
That's it for me. Yeah. But, I know poets who do write about those other aspects of the city. And I know people love cities. I know that, that's a temperament. That's a personality. But I think a lot of us are in cities for other practical reasons, to be honest. Yeah.
Jamal, something you want to add about? I know I asked you, when did you feel at home in the city? Is there anything else you want to explore with your sense of place and connection and belonging in this place called Ottawa?
Yeah, I feel like I've tried to envision myself living developing, growing, being with my wife and children in another city, in another place in the world. And of course, I've had an opportunity to travel to different places in the world just to test it out. I've never come back telling my wife or my children or my peers, I want to move from Ottawa because another place was more exciting. I feel like the energy in this city, in Ottawa, even though I moved outside the city, I live on like the outskirts, 50 minutes out, whatnot. But I feel like there's always an electrical current that's running through this city that's just about to get us to another level of, awesomeness, to be honest, to say it plainly. And I want to be here to experience all of those phases. And I feel like, the identity of Ottawa is shaping. So this is a really miraculous time to be in Ottawa. It's continuing to shape and form. And as we continue to express our voice and such, it'll be beautiful. And I just want to be there for that. So that's why I haven't left, even though I've had, kind of requests to leave and opportunities to leave and live other places. Ottawa is just that rich place. It's not too big where you'll lose yourself. And that's another thing. I was born in Toronto, raised in South America, and then came here at 9. And I just feel like all the big urbanized cities that I've been to, losing yourself in who you are, what you want to do, what you represent is kind of easy. Ottawa, you get to find yourself. I really actually find that you get to find yourself in this city. So give it a little bit more time, Deanna, please. Just a little.
Okay.
Okay. Just before I ask the next question, I don't want to, people have been putting in nominations for the city and I have to go back and look at what they are because people said, one person said Ottawa maybe is the creative city. Pam Ramage Moran said Whitehorse. Another person said Whitehorse. Somebody said Regina. I'm going to give you the answer. The creative city of literature for UNESCO that's in Canada is Quebec City. In Quebec City was doing a neat thing for Poetry Day. If I can find it, I'll read you what they were doing, but I can't find it right now. So I'm going to go to my next question. And Deanna, you started to go there when you were talking about what you like about Ottawa. So we're going to talk more about Ottawa, but I'm going to tee it up with a quote. And this is a quote from a UK-based poet, Tom Chivers, who actually describes himself as an East London poet. He's not a London poet, right? He's an East London poet, which I just love. It's just like, I'm not a New York City poet, I'm a Harlem poet, right? He's an East London poet, right? So he says this: the city resists nostalgic forms of poetry that have been handed down to us in various traditions. There is this energy and aggression and speed in a city that lends itself to poetry. We are surrounded by language, whether it's place names, signs, advertising, it's everywhere. Cities are built with language. So if you were to bring your language to the city of Ottawa, what do you find poetic about Ottawa? What are those places in Ottawa that are worthy of poetry? I want to talk about your relationship to particular places in Ottawa. What are those places that speak to you in the city? Who wants to take that on to begin?
I'll jump in. I would say for me, I mentioned the waterways. Absolutely the canal. I do remember years skating on the canal. I think of the canal and I'm being transported back to moments. One evening, a number of winters ago at night, the ice was perfect and I was skating and there were very few people on the canal. And that was magical. Like I wrote some lines toward a poem. I don't know if it ever actually was finished or became, a published poem, but I remember the lines still. And I would say, that's an occasion where I really felt the inspiration of the city. The fact that I was alone, but the city was all around me. And there is something, there's something very safe and reassuring about the city. I mean, if you are in I know, everything I say, there's an opposite is true. Sometimes, women can have issues with not feeling safe in cities and walking alone and so on. But if you're in a specific situation where you do feel that safety, there's something very comforting about sort of being embraced by the city, held. You can be alone, but not fully alone. I remember when I was a very young student and I went to Montreal to go to school, and I didn't know anyone. And for the first many months, I was quite lonely and had trouble making friends. And there were times, a lot of times, where I was just out in the city by myself. And there were times when I felt like I have a line in a poem that says, "The city was my companion." And I really felt that, like, at least, to be out in the middle of the country on a winter's night, if anyone's done that and you're alone and there are no street lights and there are no buildings with lights, and it can be quite freaky. But in the city, there's always that sense, oh, I could go to this all night restaurant and have a bagel, or there can be that sense of comfort for people who might otherwise be alone or feeling alone. So I appreciate that about the city.
Thanks, Deanna. Ben or Jamal?
Yeah, Deanna raises a good point that like cities, like a really definitive element of cities is that there's evidence of other people. And even right now, I don't know if you can hear on the mic, but I hear like a car alarm going off. And that there's something nice about that. So if I think of specific areas of Ottawa where I have like a special relationship, I can think of places where I would be alone but not feel alone. And I think of balconies I've lived, where places I've lived where one balcony from which I could see the fireworks all the way at the Lansdowne. It was in Centertown, but I could see the fireworks from the balcony. Another that was right near the Bronson Center, so I could overhear concerts and elements of even now, like every morning I go for a walk because I used to walk to work. Now I don't walk to work, I work from home. So I go for a walk anyways, and I just walk around Old City Hall and I come back. So now I have a relationship with like that weird building at Old City Hall with like the weird kind of like ladder thing that has no purpose, and all the geese there that are always like fighting, and I'm like tuned into the territory battles of those geese lately. And it's like, it's wherever I've been spending time alone, I guess I feel like I have a relationship with the city. So what Deanna said, in fact, Deanna, it's kind of a new idea that you've given me, where yes, there's such a difference between winter in the middle of nowhere and winter in the city. Like you're not as alone. So with that, I hand it off to Jamal. Can't hear you. Unmute.
Yes. That one is tough for me, and it was tough for me to answer if I was to go first. But now I know. So a relationship, I have a lot of relationships with different areas in the city, but one that I remember fondly is the Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway. Just the whole strip coming from where we at. We're looking from the west end there, from near the baseline, going all the way up to downtown Ottawa. I used to bike that pathway in the spring, summer, and fall with my dad and my younger siblings. He would take us from the west end of the city where we lived, and he would take us downtown. We'd do our shopping. We'd sometimes stop, a lot of the times we'd stop in Mechanicsville, and we'd visit some of his friends and peers there. But that bike path, especially on Sundays, right, when cars couldn't drive in the summertime, and the road would, the parkway would open up for all the bikers to take over the road. I just remember it as being like, it felt like paradise to me now that I think back about it. The water, right, of course, the green space, and the different people being out enjoying, physical activity. It felt like, in a time in my younger age when we were living from crisis to crisis. That Sunday, bike ride, or whenever we get a chance to get out there, it felt like paradise within the hecticness of my childhood. So to me, I was like, man, like, can this get any better? You got people of all walks of life just out here jogging, walking, saying hello, enjoying the vitamin D, and of course, having nature just surrounding you. It's very, very fond. One of the fonder places. You know, there's something to be said about places that we're not so fond of too, but that was definitely one of the places that brought me a lot of joy.
Thank you, Jamal.
Welcome.
I want to ask we've had some questions come in, and I want to ask one that's come in from Craig Barlow. And it's a question: does poetry today influence / change the ethics of society? And it is a big question, and I'm wondering if in Synapcity, many people would say they want to engage and impact the city and make change. And maybe we could take the question, make it a little bit bigger, and go, in general, how does poetry, I'll say, make a difference in a city? Does it? What does it do? And the particular question, it just disappeared somehow, that I just asked, was about, does it change ethics? Who'd want to explore that?
I could take a crack at it. I'm still unmuted, and I'm sure my peers can give a better answer. But does poetry change ethics? I believe that more so it supports ethics that are in place or that are novel, that are just emerging. I think it supports the change, but it's not necessary. It is not the change. I think the change comes from different spheres, but poetry is one of the, it's almost like, being an ambassador, right? The moment an ambassador gives lends their name or their title towards a new idea or concept that they're in line with, then the ambassador enhances it and amplifies it. So I think poetry amplifies ethics, ones that are traditional and ones that are new and novel. And that's what I think I'd say on that.
I think that's a great answer, Jamal. You made me think a lot. And I think because I wasn't going to tackle that question. Like that's crazy hard. I don't know the answer to that, but I think in its essence, we have to remember that in its most authentic way, poetry is voice, right? Poetry is an amplification. It's a if it becomes public, it's a public amplification of voice. So whatever perspectives, life experience, sort of identities, people, the artists, the poets have, anything that's part of them is going to be amplified in their poetry. It's sort of like we said before, like theater or music, you don't need anything to write poetry. It's, if you're a kid growing up in an underprivileged situation, I mean, it's cheap. Like, and that was me. Like I could sit with my little notebook and just get a pen, and I didn't need anyone to pay for lessons or put me in a summer camp or do anything. No one could stop me. It's what's in here. It comes out purely. And when you realize that there's power in that there's healing in that there is connection with others in that, it's a drug, really. And as one of my final projects as poet laureate, I just sort of, it's just being wrapped up. And what I did was I solicited poems, not about Ottawa, but just poems that I said, I just want them to be sort of uplifting during this pandemic. And I asked poets all over, from all different communities in the city to send me a poem. And then I had them made into posters. And we've, put them up all over the city and different neighborhoods on telephone poles. And, the fact that I didn't say poems about this or poems about that, it was just lend us your voice, like any poem. And I just said, that's just not going to, like, because poems can be dark, but just so it's not going to make people feel worse than they already feel in this pandemic. But some poems, even when we talk about our hardship, can make people feel better because they know they're not alone. They're not the only person going through something. So these poems are on these, telephone poles all over the city. And I guess that's just to say what Jamel was saying, that they just reflect voices and they support they amplify what people are going through. So I really like that answer.
I won't add much, but to say first, Deanna, I've seen these everywhere and I didn't know it was you until recently, and I love them so much. And people stop in the market and around, people stop and read them. It's an incredible initiative. So it's so cool. And I think you are very cool for thinking of it. Okay, but that said, Deanna and Jamal both raised the point that it's like voice. All I'll add is that specifically, I think that I used to have a really glib answer to the question of like, what use is poetry? And I'd say like, it's useless. That's the point. It's very fun. Now I really have changed my mind on that, probably by exposing myself to different voices in poetry lots and coming to understand that like it's measurable. Like you can get empathy by reading the poetry of others. So like you can read poems by ancient Mesopotamians and you will have a better understanding of the experience of ancient Mesopotamians. I had writing my first book, I read a lot of poems by World War I soldiers and people who had died in World War I. And that was incredible. And that gave me kind of renewed understanding of that particular experience. Now I find myself acquainting myself with poetry by marginalized voices, by Black voices, trans voices, and coming out of that with renewed empathy towards the experiences of people who are not like myself. So I totally think that that's its power, and specifically helping people understand each other better. Because a poem is somebody speaking towards themselves, right? Like sharing themselves with you as a reader. And if you choose to engage with that, then you can understand. And then the last thing I'll say, actually, I'm talking more than I thought I would, but there are actually two poets who I think of who very measurably have impacted and instigated change and political change in our world in the last few years. And one is Rupi Kaur, who's a really controversial figure because a lot of people don't like her poetry, but I like her poetry. And she has really empowered a lot of young women, and specifically, I think, brown young women, to write and to use their voices. And then another is a name that we all know, and it's Amanda Gorman, who read at the inauguration recently for Joe Biden, and who I think also has just been a really empowering voice, and who read an incredible poem at a time when the world kind of needed something positive to bond over. So that's how I answer the question of the ethics element. There are measurable impacts of poetry on the ethics world, I think.
And I wonder in bringing up empathy, Ben, that empathy leads to a certain kind of ethic. Empathy is an ethics. And Deanna, your poems that have been appearing makes me think of the quote from Adrienne Rich that we put up in talking about this session, which was, what would it mean to live in a city whose people were changing each other's despair into hope? And it's lovely that those poems are appearing, because that is what your effort is doing, right? It is such a difficult and disconnected time, and that those poems are appearing at just the right moment is lovely. It is lovely to hear.
That's a lovely quotation. Thank you for putting that up.
There's one very practical question that surfaced, and I wonder if there's just a quick answer to it. It's from David Villaroel. Sorry, David, if I mispronounced your last name. And he asks, may the poets comment on Ottawa's publishing industry if it is supporting local writers?
I'll speak very quickly towards what I really want to hear from the other two. I think that one thing that happens in Ottawa a lot is like chapbooks are a thing in Ottawa. And probably a big part of that is the Ottawa Small Press Book Fair, which is run by Rob McLennan, who's also a chapbook publisher. But even like in Inwards and Ottawa University, like chapbooks are, you can find chapbooks in Ottawa. And that's another thing where when I lived in other places, I was like, oh, there's like not really a chapbook scene, and Ottawa has that. So publishing in terms of books with spines, I can't really speak towards the publishers in Ottawa. I'm not very familiar with them, but there are a lot of chapbooks, and chapbooks are beautiful. If you don't know what chapbooks are, it's just you print it yourself, you staple it yourself, you fold it yourself, you distribute it yourself. It's a beautiful thing, and it can be very cost effective and a great way to get your voice out there. And I see a lot of chapbook presses and authors based in Ottawa, which is beautiful.
Anything to add?
I'll say that there is not currently an active, in English anyway, trade publisher of poetry that I'm aware of. In the past sort of 10 plus years that I've been paying attention, there was a publisher called Bushek Books that I think was quite local. For a while, Chaudière Press by Rob McLennan and Christine McNair was producing beautiful books. I mean, Christine was a wonderful designer and she's a book conservator. So their books were just these luscious art objects as well as the wonderful poetry inside them. But sadly, that's not happening right now. It's difficult. The market for poetry, unless it's, the Rupi Kaur type Instagram and Instagram work is limited. And so there are many publishers of poetry across Canada, and big publishers that have a poetry sort of imprint. But in Ottawa right now, maybe there's something going on in the French, the Francophone community, but I'm not aware of that. It's too bad Margaret Michelle isn't here with us tonight. Jenny Haysom in the comments is mentioning Arc Poetry Magazine, and that's a good point. So Arc Poetry Magazine has been around for, is it 40 years, I think? And it is, I think, the only literary journal in Canada that publishes strictly poetry. It also does book reviews of poetry. But anyone can submit their work to Arc Poetry Magazine. You can find their website online, and they have been doing it's a literary journal. It comes out a couple of times a year with poetry from work across Canada. But that's been a real established presence in Ottawa for decades.
Jamal, anything you want to add to this?
I don't feel that I'm qualified enough to answer the publication and how well it weaves its way into Ottawa writers, because I'm still in the stage of just publishing a lot of my work through video and or live performance, and so my knowledge of that is limited.
Thanks, Jamal, Ben, and Deanna. I want to wrap this up, and I really want to say to the three of you how you made my hosting duties incredibly easy. It was just a joy to chat with the three of you. I so appreciate the hour and a half we've had together. Thanks to all three of you. Nick, is there anything you want to add in closing before we wrap this up now?
Sure. Thank you, Ken. I'll just say that as the only non-poet on this panel, I've been happily overwhelmed by the breadth you've exposed us all to today. For my own part, I come from the theater community, and so you've all given me lines that are continuing to percolate even now. Darkness that fell early and was there by your bed when you woke up. He shows no teeth, but his grin is chin high, and so good a boy were you. I'll be chewing on those for days. So thank you all. Thank you, Ken, for hosting, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you, guys. And everyone should write poems right now, because you just got exposed to a lot of poetry stuff. So write right now if you want to.
While you're inspired.
Yeah.
It's been fun. Thank you.
This is wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye, guys. Bye, Jamal. Bye, Deanna. Nice to see you guys too.
Thank you. Good luck with the move.
Thanks.
Yes.
Okay, see you guys around.
Be well.